The stars did not tremble when the Werk came. They never did. Stars had witnessed the rise and fall of 1,000 civilizations, and they had learned indifference long before any living thing drew its first breath. But if the stars had been paying attention on that particular Tuesday morning, the 14th of March, 2387, at precisely 6:42 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, they might have noticed something worth pausing for. 10,000 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system simultaneously. The shockwave of displaced spacetime rippled outward like a stone thrown into a still pond. Instruments across the outer planets registered it. Automated buoys scattered across the Kuiper belt logged it. And deep inside a reinforced command bunker carved into the rock of the Swiss Alps, a woman named Admiral Yara Chen looked at her screens, exhaled slowly through her nose and said, "There they are." She had been waiting 3 years for this moment. Humanity had been waiting, in some form or another, for nearly a century. Aboard the Werk flagship Eternal Dominion, a ship so vast it generated its own gravitational field, Grand Admiral Sareth Vel stood at the observation deck and looked toward the distant yellow star that humans called the sun. He was 7 feet tall, gray-skinned, with 4 arms folded across his chest in the Werk gesture of supreme confidence. He had conquered 11 worlds. He had accepted the surrender of 6 species. He had never lost a campaign. He saw no reason to begin now. "Report," he said. His tactical officer, Commander Vyerth, stepped forward. "All 10,000 vessels confirm successful emergence, Grand Admiral. Formation integrity is 99.7%. We lost 4 ships to FTL miscalculation. No response from the human system. No fleet activity. No emergency transmissions detected." Vel clasped his upper hands behind his back. "Silence." "Yes, sir." "Their scouts should have detected our approach corridor 3 days ago. They should have launched a defensive fleet by now. At minimum, we should be receiving an emergency diplomatic hail." Vyerth checked his instruments again. "Nothing, sir. The system is quiet." Quiet? Vel turned the word over in his mind. In his 32 years of military service, he had learned that silence before a battle came in 2 flavors. The first was the silence of a prey animal frozen in terror, too frightened to move, waiting to be consumed. The second was something else entirely, something older, something that predators recognized in each other. He told himself it was the first kind. He told himself that with some confidence. He almost believed it. The Armada began its advance at 700 hours, moving in the precise diamond formation that had shattered the Helvari defense line 14 years ago, the same formation that had reduced the Thorn Collective's Homeworld to a negotiating table in 8 days flat. 10,000 warships, each one individually capable of cracking a moon, moving together like a single terrible organism through the cold dark between the stars. They passed the first automated buoy at the edge of the Kuiper belt. It didn't react, didn't transmit, didn't self-destruct. It simply floated there inert, its lights dark. Vyerth flagged it as non-functional and moved on. He would spend the rest of his short life regretting that assessment. 3 hours into the advance, as the Armada crossed the orbit of Neptune, Vel received the preliminary intelligence briefing he had requested on humanity. He sat in his command chair and read it with the detached professionalism of a man who had already made up his mind and was merely confirming his decision with paperwork. Humanity, species designation, Terran, Homeworld, Earth, 3rd planet orbiting Sol, population, approximately 14 billion across 17 inhabited bodies in the solar system and 4 extrasolar colonies, space-faring for 4 centuries, FTL capable for 112 years. Military strength, classified as Tier 3 threat below the Werk Dominion's threshold of serious concern. Tier 3. Vel almost smiled. The Helvari had been classified Tier 4 and they had lasted 6 days. The Thorn Collective, Tier 3, had collapsed in 3 weeks. Humanity would fall somewhere between those benchmarks. He estimated 11 days, accounting for the terrain complication of an inhabited homeworld. He closed the briefing file. He did not read the appendix. The appendix, prepared by a junior xenoanthropologist named Dr. Sane Mora, who had spent 12 years studying human history, was titled, "A Note on Species Behavioral Anomalies, Please Read Before Engagement." It was 14 pages long. It contained 17 separate warnings. The final line read, "This species is not like the others. I cannot stress this enough. Do not approach this campaign as you have approached previous campaigns. They are waiting for you, and they have been waiting for a very long time." The appendix went unread. The Armada pressed on. And somewhere in the deep dark of the asteroid belt, in the hollow belly of a rock that had no name on any Verk chart, 10,000 human soldiers checked their weapons, looked at photographs of their families, and waited. There is a building in Geneva that most humans have visited at least once in their lives, usually as schoolchildren, dragged there by teachers who understood that some lessons cannot be taught from a screen. It has no dramatic name. It is called simply the Archive of Conflict, and it occupies 6 underground floors beneath a quiet park where birds sing and children play in complete ignorance of what lies beneath their feet. The archive contains the complete documented history of every war humanity has ever fought. Every single one. The collection begins with cave paintings, crude red ochre images of figures striking each other with stones, drawn by hands that had been dead for 30,000 years. It moves through bronze and iron, through the invention of the bow, the catapult, the cannon, the rifle, the tank, the aircraft, the missile, the nuclear weapon, the orbital kinetic strike platform. It documents 2 world wars that killed a combined total of over 100 million people. It contains the battle plans of Napoleon, the tactical doctrines of Sun Tzu, the strategic memos of generals whose names most people have forgotten, but whose ideas quietly shaped everything that came after. 12 years before the Verk fleet appeared at the edge of the Sol system, a young Verk intelligence officer named Tarn had been sent to Earth as part of a diplomatic exchange program. A program the Verk used primarily to gather information on species they were considering for subjugation. Tarn had visited the archive on her 3rd day on Earth. She had gone in expecting to be done in 2 hours. She came out 7 hours later, pale beneath her gray skin, and sat on a bench in the park above and did not move for a very long time. Her report, filed 6 weeks later and immediately classified by Dominion Intelligence, opened with a line that her superiors had found overwrought and dramatic at the time. "This species has been rehearsing for war since before it could write. It has forgotten more about killing than most civilizations have ever learned." She had documented the specific things that troubled her, not the weapons. The Verk had better weapons, more advanced, more powerful. Not the numbers. 14 billion was large but manageable. What troubled her was the pattern. Humans had gone to war over food, water, land, religion, ideology, pride, fear, misunderstanding, and boredom. They had fought wars that lasted a single afternoon and wars that ground on for 100 years. They had fought in every climate on their planet: frozen tundra, burning desert, dense jungle, open ocean, underground tunnels. And they had developed specific, refined, brutal tactics for every single one of those environments. They had fought wars with 10 soldiers and wars with 10 million. They had won some and lost some, and learned from all of them. And then, 160 years ago, they had stopped. Not because they became peaceful, not because they transcended conflict. They stopped fighting each other because they made a decision, collectively and with characteristic human bluntness, that war between humans was a waste of resources they were going to need for something else. The last major human conflict, the Pacific Resource War of 2231, ended not with a peace treaty but with a joint communiqué signed by all parties that read, in part, "We have been shooting each other for long enough. Something is coming from out there eventually, and we intend to be ready." Something. They had not known who. They had not known when. But they had known, with a certainty born from centuries of watching the stars and listening to the silence, that they were not alone, and that not everyone in the universe was friendly. So they had stopped killing each other and started building. Aboard the Eternal Dominion, Commander Vyerth was the one who finally found Saya Tarn's report in the intelligence archives. He found it at 2200 hours on the second day of the advance, when he was supposed to be sleeping, and instead was doing what good officers do before a campaign, reading everything, including the things his superiors had dismissed. He read the report in full. He read it again. Then he walked to Grand Admiral Vel's private quarters and knocked on the door. Vel answered in his sleeping robe, irritated. "This had better be significant, Commander." Vyerth held out the data pad. His hand, Vel noticed, was not quite steady. "Sir, there is a classified intelligence report from 12 years ago. It was filed by an embedded observer on Earth. I think you need to read it." Vel took the pad, skimmed the opening. His expression shifted from irritation to mild interest to something more careful and contained. He read in silence for 4 minutes. When he looked up, his voice was measured and deliberate. "Why was this not included in my primary briefing?" "It was classified as speculative, sir. The analyst was considered alarmist." Vel looked back at the data pad, at the line that read, "They are not building a fleet to fight you. They are building a system. Their entire solar system is the weapon." He set the pad down slowly. "Current position of the fleet. Crossing the asteroid belt now, sir. Approximately 19 hours from Mars." Vel was quiet for a long moment. Outside his viewport, the asteroids drifted in their ancient orbits, silent and dark and apparently empty. "Increase sensor sweep radius," he said finally. "Full spectrum, every rock, every shadow, every anomaly." Vyerth nodded and turned to go. "And Commander," Vel's voice stopped him at the door, "wake the medical staff, tell them to prepare for casualties." It was the first honest thing Vel had said since the campaign began. It would not be the last. The asteroid designated UX7714 on Verk charts had no name in any human database either, because officially it did not exist. It was listed on all publicly available solar system maps as a standard carbonaceous chondrite, composition unremarkable, diameter approximately 4 kilometers, no strategic value. What the maps did not show, because the maps had been deliberately, carefully, expertly falsified 11 years ago by a team of engineers from the Terran Defense Directorate, was the interior. Inside UX7714, carved out over 8 years of quiet, patient work, was a mass driver array capable of launching 20-kilogram tungsten slugs at 0.003, the speed of light. There were 412 installations like it throughout the asteroid belt. Nobody had leaked this information to the Verk, not because humanity was perfectly secure, no species is perfectly secure, but because the people who knew about the installations understood with cold clarity that the secret was only useful once. Leak it, and the Verk would find another approach vector. Keep it, and the killing field was perfect. The order to fire came from Admiral Chen, in her Swiss Alps bunker, at 3:14 hours on the third day of the advance. She did not make a speech. She did not deliver a rallying cry. She looked at her tactical display, confirmed that the first Verk Vanguard 200 ships sent ahead as a screening force had entered the kill zone and said 4 words into her headset. "Light them up." What happened in the next 11 minutes was later studied at every major military academy on Earth for generations. Students would pause the simulation at key moments, rewind, play it again, try to find the moment where the Verk could have responded differently. They never found it. The engagement had been designed to have no such moment. The first slugs came from directly ahead, 3 mass drivers firing in sequence, targeting the lead formation. The Verk point defense systems were excellent and caught several, but the second volley came from the left flank from 3 different vectors, timed to arrive while the point defense was reorienting. The third volley came from below, from installations hidden in the plane of the ecliptic that no Verk tactical model had accounted for, because no Verk tactical model had seriously considered that the enemy might have turned the entire orbital architecture of a star system into a weapons platform. The vanguard tried to scatter. The scatter paths had been anticipated. There were installations there too. Ships began to die. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way that space battles are sometimes described, not in explosions of fire and light. In the vacuum of space, ships that are struck by kinetic impactors at those velocities simply come apart. They fragment. They become clouds of debris that spread outward in slowly expanding spheres, and if you were watching from a distance, it might almost look peaceful, almost look natural, like flowers opening. In 11 minutes, all 200 ships of the Werk Vanguard were gone. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, the silence following the telemetry blackout was the most profound silence Grand Admiral Vell had ever experienced. His officers stood at their stations and stared at their screens, and no one said anything for a full 30 seconds, because no one could find words that were proportionate to what had just happened. Vyerth found his voice first. It was admirably steady. "Sir, the Vanguard is gone, all 200 vessels. Engagement duration was 11 minutes and 17 seconds. Casualties? Total loss, sir." Another silence. "Weapons assessment. Mass driver kinetics, sir. Railgun technology, consistent with known human engineering but significantly beyond what our intelligence suggested was their current capability." Vyerth paused. "The installations were embedded in asteroid bodies. We're conducting an emergency scan of the surrounding belt now. Initial results are..." He stopped. "Speak, Commander." "Initial results suggest over 400 separate installations, sir. Possibly more. The scan isn't complete." Vell stood very still. He was doing mathematics in his head. 400 installations. 200 ships destroyed in 11 minutes. The main fleet numbered 9,800 now. He thought about the geometry of the asteroid belt, the angles, the approach vectors. He thought about the 14-page report he had read the night before. He thought about the line, "Their entire solar system is the weapon." He had thought it was hyperbole. It was not hyperbole. "Recall the fleet," he said. "Full stop. I want a complete tactical reassessment before we move another kilometer." "Sir," Vyerth said carefully, "the High Council's orders were..." "I know what the High Council's orders were." Vell's voice was quiet but absolute. "The High Council is not currently standing inside humanity's shooting gallery. I am, full stop." The fleet halted. And in the Swiss Alps bunker, Admiral Chen looked at her tactical display showing 10,000 Werk ships suddenly motionless in the asteroid belt, and she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Because a fleet that had stopped to reassess was a fleet that was afraid. And a fleet that was afraid had already started losing, even if it didn't know it yet. "Phase 2 on my mark," she said. "Let them stew for a while." She poured herself a cup of tea. She was very good at waiting. All humans were. They had been practicing for a long time. On the 4th day, Grand Admiral Vell did something he had never done in 32 years of military service. He asked for a diplomatic channel. It was not weakness, he told himself. It was intelligence gathering. It was tactical. Speaking to the enemy before crushing them was a legitimate stratagem. You learned things. You identified psychological pressure points. You gave them the chance to surrender and thus saved your own forces the effort of a prolonged engagement. He had done it twice before with other species. Both times the conversation had lasted less than 4 minutes, ending with tearful capitulations and promises of tribute. He expected something similar now. His communications officer established the channel and sent the standard Dominion hailing protocol. A sequence of mathematical primes that every spacefaring species eventually learned to recognize as the Werk equivalent of "We are more powerful than you, and we would like to discuss the terms of your compliance." The response came in 47 seconds, which was, Vell reflected, a very fast response time for a species that was supposedly scrambling to defend its homeworld. The face that appeared on his screen surprised him. He had expected a military officer, a general, perhaps, or a head of state, someone in a uniform, seated at a dramatic command console with screens and alerts and the visible architecture of crisis around them. He had expected someone who looked afraid. Instead, he was looking at a woman of perhaps 60 years, with dark brown skin, close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that had clearly made a decision to stop being surprised by things some years ago. She was wearing a plain gray jacket. She was sitting at what appeared to be a modest wooden desk. There was a window behind her showing a mountain range, snow-capped and indifferent. There was a ceramic mug near her right hand. She was drinking tea. "Grand Admiral Vel," she said. Her accent was precise and unhurried. "My name is Coordinator Amara Osai. I represent the Terran Continuity Council. We've been expecting your call." Vel kept his expression neutral with the practiced ease of a career military officer. "Coordinator, you are aware that your vanguard defense has been noted. However, the Verk Dominion's fleet remains at full operational strength. Any further resistance will only—" "Grand Admiral." Her voice was not rude. It was not aggressive. It was the voice of someone correcting a minor factual error in a casual conversation. "You entered this system with 10,000 ships. You currently have 9,791. You have been stationary in the asteroid belt for 19 hours because your tactical assessment software cannot resolve the full extent of our installation network." She paused. "That's not a criticism. It's a genuinely complex system to model." Vel said nothing. He was recalculating. "I'd like to share some information with you," Osai continued, "not as a negotiating tactic, but as a professional courtesy. What you encountered in the outer belt was the first of 7 defensive layers designed around this solar system. Each subsequent layer is more densely integrated than the last. The installations you've identified represent approximately 12% of our total fixed defense infrastructure." She picked up her mug and held it in both hands, not drinking it, just warming her palms. "Between your current position and Earth, you will encounter coordinated drone swarms, electronic warfare grids, an autonomous mine network in Martian orbit, a deep-cover strike fleet currently positioned in a location I obviously won't disclose, and approximately 400,000 ground personnel on Earth alone, operating on terrain that has been specifically prepared and studied for generational-scale defensive warfare." Silence on the bridge. Several of Vel's officers had turned from their stations and were listening. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you," Osai said. Her tone was sincere in a way that somehow made it worse. "I'm telling you because the Verk Dominion is not an evil civilization and your soldiers are not evil people. They came here following orders and they deserve the chance to go home." She set the mug down. "Retreat now. Take your ships and leave. This does not have to be a catastrophe." Vel looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the 11 minutes it had taken to destroy his vanguard. He thought about 400 installations. He thought about 12%. And then he thought about the High Council, about the political architecture of his civilization, about what it would mean to appear before them and say that he had turned 9,000 ships around because a human woman in a gray jacket had asked him politely. "Coordinator Osai," he said, "the Verk Dominion does not retreat from Tier 3 species." Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not anger, not fear, something quieter and more final than either of those things. "I understand," she said. She cut the channel. For a moment the bridge was silent. Then Vel's logistics officer spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, did she just call us a Tier 3 species?" Vel did not answer. He straightened his jacket, turned to face his fleet, and gave the order to advance. Behind him, he did not see the look that passed between Vyerth and the communications officer. A quick, involuntary glance that said, without words, "We are going to die here." In her bunker in the Swiss Alps, Coordinator Osai set down her tea, turned to the assembled staff around her and said calmly, "They're moving. Execute Phase 2. Nobody in that room had expected the Verk to accept the offer. They had made the offer anyway because that was who they were. Because if there was even a small chance to avoid it, you took the chance. But they had been ready. They had always been ready. Phase 2 began. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not show up on any standardized assessment, any psychological profile, any scan of neural architecture. You cannot measure it in laboratory conditions because it only emerges under specific circumstances involving prolonged stress, incomplete information, and the absolute certainty that the cost of failure is everything you have ever loved. Humans called it adaptability. The Werk, who had a word for most things, did not have a word for this because they had never needed one. Every species they had conquered had followed a predictable arc. Detect the Werk: advance, panic, attempt, resistance, collapse. The arc varied in length but not in shape. 14 species, same arc, every time. On the fifth day, as the Werk armada pushed through the inner asteroid belt toward Mars, they encountered the drone swarms, and they discovered that humans did not follow the arc. The drones were not impressive individually. They were each about the size of a human fist, small, cheap, built in orbital factories by the hundreds of millions over the course of a decade. Each one carried a tiny explosive charge and a sensor package and a simple decision-making algorithm. None of them were particularly dangerous alone. In groups of 10,000, moving in coordinated patterns that shifted every 3.7 seconds, they were a different matter entirely. The Werk point defense systems were designed to track and destroy incoming projectiles, missiles, and fighters. They were extraordinarily good at this. What they were not designed for was an enemy that behaved like a fluid flowing around destroyed sections, reforming, penetrating through the gaps created by the point defense's own firing patterns, using the rhythms of the defense systems against themselves. The Werk adapted. They always adapted. They shifted their point defense timing, randomized their firing patterns, deployed countermeasures. It worked partially for about 4 hours. Then the drone behavior changed. Because the drones were not operating on a fixed algorithm, they were being updated in real time by an AI system running on servers buried 3 kilometers under the surface of Phobos, and that system was watching the Werk adaptations and countering them. Not all at once. That would have been obvious. But gradually, incrementally, like a chess player who is not trying to win the current position, but to set up a position 20 moves from now. Commander Vyerth noticed it first. He had been watching the engagement analytics for 6 hours straight when the pattern appeared to him, not as a tactical insight, but as a feeling, an itching wrongness in the data that he couldn't immediately articulate. He pulled up the drone behavior logs and compared them against the Werk defense adaptations, and he saw it. The drones weren't trying to destroy the ships, not primarily. They were learning the ships, mapping the point defense coverage, the shield harmonics, the sensor blind spots. Every drone that was destroyed had transmitted its final sensor data back to the central system before it died. The Werk were winning every individual engagement and losing the strategic picture with every victory. He brought this to Vel immediately. Vel listened. His expression did not change. Recommendation. We need to go dark, sir. Full electromagnetic silence, randomized movement patterns, disable the networked targeting systems, and revert to independent ship operations. Vyerth hesitated. It will reduce our combat efficiency significantly. But it will stop feeding them data. Yes, sir. Vel considered for 3 seconds. Do it. It was the right call. It was also, unfortunately, 3 hours too late, because by the time the Werk fleet went dark, the AI system under Phobos had already constructed a near-complete tactical model of the entire Werk fleet's defensive architecture. It knew, with approximately 78% confidence, the point defense blind spots of every class of Werk warship in the Armada. It began distributing that information to the next layer of the system. It did so quietly, almost gently, like someone who has been holding all the cards since the beginning of the game and sees no reason to rush. The electronic warfare began on the 6th day, and it was unlike anything the Werk had encountered before. Not because it was more technologically advanced than Werk systems, but because it was human in its fundamental approach. Rather than attempting to overwhelm or directly hack Werk systems, the interference was conversational. It introduced subtle errors into the targeting solutions. Not enough to be immediately obvious, not enough to trigger the automatic error correction protocols, but enough that over time, across thousands of ships and millions of targeting calculations, the accumulated drift became operationally significant. Verk weapons that should have hit missed by 11 meters, by 30 meters, by a kilometer. Individual ships began reporting anomalies. The anomaly reports were, themselves, slightly corrupted, making the picture at Fleet Command murkier than it should have been. Vyerth called it cognitive infiltration in his log. He noted that it was a technique more commonly associated with psychological warfare than electronic warfare. He noted that it required a deep, intimate understanding of the enemy's systems, the kind of understanding that could only come from years of dedicated study. He wrote, "They have been studying us for a very long time. Everything we know about them was gathered over a period of months by scouts, most of whom did not return. Everything they know about us was gathered over decades by a civilization that had decided, before we ever arrived, that we would come eventually. The information asymmetry is catastrophic." He marked the log entry private and kept it from the Fleet Command channel. He did not want to be the one to say, officially, what every officer in the Armada was beginning to privately understand. That this was not a defense they were facing, it was a trap. And the trap had been set before most of the soldiers in this fleet were born. On the 7th day, the Armada reached Mars. Or rather, it reached where Mars was supposed to be and found something that looked like Mars from a distance, but was, in practice, a kill zone with a planet in the middle of it. The mine network in Martian orbit was not subtle. There was no point in subtlety at this stage. The mines were the size of small cars, packed with shaped charges designed to punch through Verk hull plating, and there were 4 million of them arranged in a spherical shell around the planet. 50 Verk ships were destroyed before the mine network was neutralized. Another 300 were damaged. The Armada pressed on, because that is what armies do when they are committed. They press on. They press on even when the rational calculation says retreat, because retreat requires a different kind of courage than advance, and not everyone has cultivated it. Vel stood at his observation deck and looked at the battle damage reports accumulating on his screens. He was doing the arithmetic that he had been avoiding since the first day. 10,000 ships, 200 in the Vanguard, 50 at Mars, 300 damaged, plus the ongoing attrition from the drone swarms, the electronic disruptions, the accumulated operational wear of a fleet that had been under continuous low-level engagement for 7 days. He had entered this system with 10,000 ships. He was going to reach Earth with considerably fewer. And he still hadn't encountered a single human soldier face to face. In the Swiss Alps, Admiral Chen looked at the same numbers from the other direction and felt the particular cold satisfaction of watching a plan execute correctly. Not pride, not excitement, something more surgical than that. She pulled up the Phase 3 protocols and began reviewing them for the 14th time. Phase 3 was the ground engagement. She had been looking forward to Phase 3 the least. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she knew exactly what it would cost, both sides. And she had never once, in 20 years of planning this defense, allowed herself to forget that the Verk soldiers were following orders just as her own soldiers were, that they had families, that they would die in a solar system 100 light years from anyone who loved them. She remembered this, she held it close. And then she gave the order anyway. Because that is the other thing about humans. They can hold two truths at the same time, the humanity of the enemy and the necessity of stopping them, and they can act on both simultaneously, carrying the weight of both, and not let either one paralyze them. It is not a comfortable way to live. But it works. There is a reason armies throughout human history have described the experience of entering a city prepared for defense as entering the throat of the enemy. It is not a metaphor chosen for its poetry. It is chosen because it is accurate. A prepared city does not feel like a place. It feels like a living thing, patient, alert, breathing quietly through 1,000 unseen passages. And when you step inside it, You understand with sudden animal clarity that you have made a very consequential decision. 500 Verk ships broke from the main fleet at 200 hours on the 8th day and began atmospheric entry over 3 continents simultaneously. The tactic was sound by conventional doctrine, distributed landing zones, too many points of conflict for the defender to concentrate force, overwhelming numbers on the ground. The commanders had done everything right. They had done everything right in a situation that had been engineered from the ground up to make doing everything right insufficient. The first thing they noticed was the silence. The cities were empty, not abandoned in panic. There were no overturned vehicles, no scattered belongings, no signs of the chaotic evacuation that preceded every other planetary assault in Verk military history. The cities had been emptied with precision and patience over the preceding weeks, while the Armada was still working its way through the outer system. 14 billion people had dispersed into pre-prepared shelter networks, hardened underground facilities, and the vast rural expanses that made up most of Earth's surface. The evacuation had been rehearsed, multiple times. The first rehearsal had been 40 years ago. The Verk landing forces set down in empty streets and empty squares and empty airports, and the silence pressed against them like a physical weight. Sergeant Dorak, commanding a ground unit of 40 soldiers in what had been Chicago, reported back to his ship with the precise and careful language of a soldier trying to describe something he does not have adequate framework for. The city is intact. Infrastructure appears functional. No civilian population visible. No military presence visible. No engagement, awaiting orders. His orders came. Advance toward the city center, establish a command position, await reinforcements. He led his unit forward. They were 17 blocks from the landing zone when the city woke up. It did not wake up all at once. That would have been simpler. It woke up in pieces, from unexpected directions, in ways that were precisely calibrated to force response patterns that created vulnerabilities. A sniper shot from a building 300 meters away, not fatal, aimed at a non-lethal target, designed to make the unit take cover and compress into a formation. Compressed formations in urban environments have predictable cover choices. The cover choices in this particular intersection had been accounted for. The second shot came from the predicted angle of the predicted cover position. Dorak, who was not a stupid man, recognized within 4 minutes that the engagement was not trying to kill his unit. It was trying to move it, hurt it, walk it down a particular corridor of streets toward a particular destination. He stopped his unit, held position, called for drone support. The drones were jammed within 1 block of their position by a system he could not locate. He called for artillery support from the ship overhead. The ship reported that it was engaged with surface-to-orbit weapons platforms that had activated when the landing force moved out of the landing zone. He looked at his unit, 14 soldiers. He had started with 40. He had not seen the moment any of them went down. They had simply, quietly, been removed from the equation one by one in the 17 blocks between the landing zone and his current position, without his unit ever identifying the shooters. He pulled up his tactical map. The route behind him was showing red. The route ahead was showing green, clear, open. He understood with cold certainty that the route ahead was green because they wanted him to go that way. He sat down in the middle of the street, ordered his unit to form a defensive circle, and did not move. 3 minutes later, a human soldier appeared at the end of the block, no weapon raised, hands visible. "Sergeant," the soldier said, in accented but clear Verk standard, "your landing force has been fragmented. You are the largest intact unit currently operating in this city. I am authorized to offer you the opportunity to surrender." Dorak looked at the soldier. He looked at his 12 remaining fighters. He looked at the empty city around them, which was not empty at all, which was full of things he could not see and could not defeat. He set down his weapon. Across Earth, in 300 other cities, the same conversation was being repeated with small variations. Most ended the same way. Some did not, and those that did not ended more finally. The commanders watching from orbit had no coherent picture of what was happening on the ground because communications were being selectively degraded by a system they could not locate, passing through only enough information to make the full picture seem like it might be accessible if they pushed harder. It was a technique drawn from human electronic warfare doctrine, developed across 100 years of internal conflicts, refined to a science. You do not blind the enemy entirely. You blur them. You let them see just enough to believe clarity is possible, so they keep looking instead of acting. Of the 500 ships that had entered the atmosphere, the ones that attempted to provide fire support found themselves targeted by a surface-to-orbit network that had been completely dormant until this moment, batteries built into mountain ranges, hidden under ocean floors, disguised as geological formations. They had never appeared on any sensor sweep because they had been built to be inert until called upon, and they were called upon now with devastating precision. The ships that attempted to retrieve their ground forces found the landing zones occupied by a different kind of human soldier, not the snipers and guerrilla fighters in the cities, but heavy infantry in powered armor, specialists in what humans called anti-access denial, whose specific job was to make sure that no Verk soldier who had put boots on Earth's soil was going to lift off again. The battle for Earth's surface lasted 4 days. When it was over, of the 500 ships that had entered the atmosphere, none had left. 412,000 Verk soldiers had landed on Earth. Approximately 90,000 had surrendered. The rest were gone, lost in the throats of cities that had been built, one building at a time, one street at a time, one prepared position at a time, to swallow armies whole and never give them back. Vel received the final report from the ground campaign on the 12th day. He read it 3 times. He did not speak to anyone for 6 hours. Then he called a command council and said 4 words that no Verk Grand Admiral had said in the history of the Dominion's military. "We need to leave." The room was silent. "Sir," his second admiral said carefully, "the High Council is not here." Vel's voice was flat, final. "We have lost 40% of this fleet and we have not yet engaged their strategic reserve. We have not yet reached Earth orbit. We are hemorrhaging ships to systems we cannot fully map and cannot destroy without." He stopped, collected himself. "We need to leave." No one argued. No one argued because there was no argument to make. The mathematics were unambiguous. They were losing, and they were losing not to a fleet, not to a force they could identify and destroy, but to a system, a patient, vast, interlocking machine made of an entire solar system, and the ingenuity of a species that had been preparing for this specific moment for over a century. The fleet began to turn. It was then that the humans revealed the final layer. There is a particular cruelty in waiting. Not the cruelty of malice. Humans, in the main, are not a malicious species, but the cruelty of necessity, of strategy, of understanding that the most effective moment to strike is not when the enemy is strong and advancing, but when they are broken and retreating, because a retreating army that reaches safety and regroups is a future problem, and humanity, as a civilization, had learned through 10,000 years of painful experience to solve problems when they were in front of you rather than let them grow into future ones. The strike fleet that had been waiting in Jupiter's shadow had been there for 19 days. 1,400 ships, not the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled but the most precisely selected. Every captain had been chosen for specific qualities, tactical flexibility, psychological resilience, and a particular kind of cold professionalism that allowed a person to do what needed to be done without either enjoying it or being destroyed by it. The fleet had run no communications during its wait, no active sensors, nothing that could be detected. They had drifted on passive systems in the enormous radiation shadow of the largest planet in the solar system, and they had waited. The order to move came from Admiral Chen at 600 hours on the 13th day. She did not tell them to be merciful. She did not tell them to be brutal. She told them in the precise and unornamented language of military communication to execute the interception protocol and to complete it. They knew what that meant. They had trained for it for 3 years. They understood, each one of them, what they were doing and why, and they had made their peace with it or they had not been selected. The fleet moved out of Jupiter's shadow like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. The Verk Armada had been retreating for 6 hours when the contact alarm sounded on the Eternal Dominion's bridge. Vyarth looked at the sensor reading. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the size of the contact, and the velocity, and the vector, and the fact that it was coming from a direction that the fleet had already passed through and deemed clear, because no fleet could have hidden in that direction without being detected, because Jupiter's radiation shadow was exactly the kind of place you'd clear first. Unless the enemy's passive sensor systems were significantly better than yours. Unless they'd been hiding there the whole time. Unless they had waited, specifically and patiently, for you to get past them and then commit to a retreat vector, so that you would be running away from them when they came out, which meant the geometry of engagement would be entirely in their favor, which meant. Battle stations, Vel said. It was the right call. Everything about it was the right call. Vel was a good admiral. He had always been a good admiral. He was a good admiral facing a situation that had been engineered by people who had spent decades specifically preparing to fight good admirals. The engagement at Jupiter lasted 11 hours, and there will be students who study it forever, because it is a masterclass in what happens when a rested, fully supplied, tactically coordinated force engages a depleted, psychologically damaged, operationally degraded one. The human fleet did not have superior numbers. The Verk still outnumbered them nearly 4-1. It did not matter. The human fleet had superior information, superior positioning, superior morale, and the particular savage efficiency of people who are fighting for their home and know the fight is almost over. The Verk fleet tried to reform. The human fleet disrupted the reformation with precision strikes at the command ships, the ships holding the formation together. It tried to punch through. The human fleet let it punch and then collapsed around the punching force and cut it off. It tried to scatter. Some of the scattered ships got through. Most did not. Vel fought well. He made every correct decision available to him. He improvised, he adapted, he held his center when other commanders were breaking, and he bought time with each correct decision for more of his ships to reach the edge of the system. Time, in the end, was the only thing he could buy. He had already spent everything else. At hour 9, the Eternal Dominion took a direct hit to its main drive systems. The ship did not explode. It lurched sideways, venting atmosphere, and began a slow rotation that made targeting and navigation both functionally impossible. Vel, bleeding from a head wound, clinging to the railing at his command station, looked at his bridge, at the screens showing the engagement, at the numbers. He had entered this system with 10,000 ships. He had perhaps 40 still fighting. He found Vyarth. Vyarth was at his station, jaw set, eyes clear, doing his job with the quiet professionalism that Vel had always respected in him. "Get them out," Vel said. "Whatever you can, get them out." "Sir." "That is an order, Commander." Vyarth held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the communications console and sent the signal, not encrypted, not coded, broadcast on every frequency. The retreat order, the absolute and final retreat order, the one that meant save yourself, every ship for itself, leave the system, leave everything, run. He sent it. And then he stayed at his station, because someone had to, because the Eternal Dominion was no longer capable of running, and someone had to keep the guns firing long enough for the ships that could run to get clear. He was 29 years old. He had a mother on the Verk Homeworld who grew flowers in a garden by a river. He stayed at his station. 10 ships made it clear of the Sol system. 10 out of 10,000. They limped through the FTL threshold, trailing debris and radiation, and the particular silence of people who have seen something they cannot process, something that has rearranged the architecture of their understanding of the universe in ways that will never fully be rebuilt. The last thing their rear sensors recorded before the FTL bubble closed was an image of the Sol system from outside, the yellow star at the center, the planets in their ancient orbits, the debris field of 9,990 ships spreading slowly through the dark, and Earth still there, still whole, still blue and green and impossibly, stubbornly alive. The journey home took 12 days. On most ships, there was very little talking. Soldiers and officers sat in corridors and mess halls and cargo bays and looked at walls or floors or each other, and the conversations that did happen were short and careful and avoided by unspoken agreement, the central thing, the thing that sat in the middle of every person's mind like a stone, enormous and immovable and without frame of reference. On the third day, a junior tactical officer named Geith, 22 years old, veteran of one previous campaign, sat down next to a senior weapons specialist named Haru, who had fought in 3 campaigns over 14 years and who was generally regarded as unshakable. How, Geith said. Haru was quiet for a moment. They knew we were coming. We knew they knew. We had reports that they were preparing. No, Haru shook his head. Knowing and knowing are different things. We knew they were building defenses. We thought they were building a fence. They were building a maze, a trap, a killing floor. He paused. They've been building it for 100 years, longer maybe. And they built it not because they knew we specifically were coming. They built it because they assumed eventually someone would come and they decided to be ready. Geith stared at the floor. How do you prepare for something for 100 years? Haru thought about it for a long time. You believe in it, he said finally. You believe in it so completely that you pass the belief down to your children and your children believe it and they pass it down to their children. And you don't wait for the threat to arrive before you act. You act as if it's coming now, every year, every generation, and the day it actually comes, you're ready because you've been ready for 100 years. He paused again. We don't have a word for that. I don't think any species has a word for that except them. Geith was quiet. Then, did we know, the High Council, did they know it was going to be like this? Haru looked at him. There was a report, filed 12 years ago. I heard about it from someone who read it. And the High Council classified it as speculative and sent 10,000 ships anyway. He stood up slowly, his old campaign injuries making themselves known in the way they always did now, the dull, permanent ache of a body that had been through things bodies were not designed to go through. That's the other thing about the High Council. They believe what they want to believe. They always have. He walked away down the corridor. Geith sat alone for a while longer. Then he went to find a data pad and started writing down everything he could remember. Not for the official report, just for himself, just because it felt important somehow to remember it accurately, to not let it become legend or simplification or comfortable narrative, to keep the truth of it terrible and precise. He was not the only one on those 10 ships doing this. The Verk High Council convened in full session to hear the survivors' report on the 42nd day after the fleet's departure. The session was held in the Grand Chamber of Reckoning, a room designed to seat the most powerful governing body in the Dominion, and to make everyone in it feel appropriately significant. The 10 surviving commanders did not feel significant. They filed in and sat down and looked at the rows of council members and the Grand Arbiter on his elevated platform, and they had the slightly unfocused look of people who have recently returned from somewhere that changed their eyes. The senior surviving officer, a captain named Death, whose ship had been the farthest from the main engagement when Vyerth's retreat order came, gave the formal report. She gave it in the flat, precise language of official documentation, working through the engagement timeline, the casualty figures, the tactical assessments. She used the correct terminology and cited the correct protocols and delivered information that amounted to the near-total destruction of the greatest military force the Dominion had ever assembled with the practiced steadiness of a professional soldier reporting facts. When she finished, the Grand Arbiter looked at her for a long moment. "Captain," he said, "the Dominion has never lost 10,000 ships." "No, sir. We have never lost a campaign against a Tier 3 species." "No, sir." Your assessment, then. What is humanity's correct threat classification? Death was quiet for several seconds. Around her, the other 9 survivors waited. Grand Arbiter, she said. With respect, the threat classification system does not contain a category for what we encountered at Saul. Murmuring through the chamber. Explain, the Arbiter said. Death thought carefully about how to say it. She had been thinking about how to say it for 12 days. She had tried 15 different formulations and discarded all of them as inadequate. She went with the one that was the most honest, even though it was the least comfortable. Every species we have encountered in the Dominion's history has fought to win, she said. Their calculus when threatened is, do I have sufficient force to achieve victory? If yes, engage. If no, surrender or flee. This is rational. This is how most civilizations that survive long enough to reach space have learned to think, because rational resource management is a prerequisite for long-term survival. She paused. The chamber was very quiet. Humanity does not fight to win, she continued. Humanity fights to not lose. These are not the same thing. A species fighting to win accepts defeat when the cost of continued resistance exceeds the probability of victory. A species fighting to not lose does not perform this calculation. It performs a different calculation. It asks, what is the cost of losing? And if the answer is everything, their home, their people, their existence as a civilization, then the cost of continued resistance is always acceptable, no matter how high, because the alternative is worse. She looked at the Arbiter steadily. There is no force calculation that wins against this. You cannot threaten them into surrender because they have already accepted, at a civilizational level, that the price of defense is everything they have. You cannot overwhelm them because they will absorb whatever you bring and turn it against you. You cannot wait them out because they have been waiting for 100 years, and they are very, very good at it. The silence in the chamber was absolute. They sent 10,000 ships, Death said, and her voice was very quiet now and very clear. We sent our best. We sent everything the Dominion could assemble. We sent it against a species that had been waiting for us specifically or someone like us for 100 years. And of 10,000 ships, she stopped, breathed. 10 came home. The Grand Arbiter looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, what do you recommend? Leave them alone, Death said, forever. On Earth, on a clear morning 3 weeks after the last Verk ship cleared the heliopause, Coordinator Amara Osei stood on a hillside in Ghana and looked up at a sky that was blue and clean and free. Around her, the reconstruction work was already underway, cities being reopened, people emerging from shelters blinking in the light, the slow, careful work of returning to normal that follows every terrible thing. It would take years. Some things would not fully recover. She held a tablet showing the final casualty reports. She had been looking at them for a long time, not trying to process them. You could not process them, not really, not in any way that was clean or finished. Just holding them, acknowledging them, refusing to look away. Then she closed the tablet and looked at the sky. Somewhere up there, 10 Verk ships were running toward home. She thought about the soldiers on those ships, what they were carrying with them, what they would do with it. She hoped genuinely, without political calculation, just as a human being on a hillside in the morning, that they would tell the truth when they got there. She hoped the people who heard them would listen. She thought about the appendix in the intelligence report that Vel had never read, the 14 pages, the 17 warnings, the final line. She had written that line 22 years ago as a young xenoanthropology researcher assigned to study the Verk Dominion's expansion patterns. She had filed the report, and it had been classified, and she had spent 22 years rising through the Continuity Council, always knowing, always preparing, always passing the preparation down. She had written, "They are waiting for you, and they have been waiting for a very long time." She had been right. She picked up her tablet and sent a single message to the Continuity Council's full assembly. It read, Phase 1 complete. Begin long-range monitoring of all Dominion territories. Maintain all installation readiness at full operational status. debrief captured personnel with full medical care, and prepare repatriation protocol. She paused, added one more line. And remember, this was the first time. Make sure it's the only time. She sent it and put the tablet in her pocket and stood on the hillside in Ghana and felt the sun on her face, which was warm and which was hers, and which she intended to keep. Below her, the world was coming back to life. Far out in the galaxy, the stars maintained their ancient silence. But in the corridors of 100 alien civilizations, through diplomatic channels and intelligence networks, and the quiet word-of-mouth of species who traded in information the way humans traded in iron and silicon and stubborn, unreasonable hope, a story was beginning to spread. Not a story about the Verk Dominion's defeat, though that was part of it. A story about a small, young, unremarkable species on a small, unremarkable world, who looked up at the stars and understood, earlier than most, what the stars contained, who chose instead of fear to prepare, who waited with extraordinary patience and extraordinary care, and when the time came, defended their home with everything they had, without apology and without hesitation. Slowly, carefully, the other civilizations of the galaxy began to revise their assessments of humanity. Slowly, they stopped calling them Tier 3. Slowly, they stopped calling them anything at all, because it turned out there was no existing category that fit, and creating a new one felt, somehow, like an acknowledgement they weren't quite ready to make. 10 ships went home and told the truth. The galaxy listened. And for the first time in a very long time, it was afraid of something other than the dark. The end.